friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Before I begin, may I seek the chair's permission to acknowledge two groups of people who are present with us here this morning. First is I would like to acknowledge the presence of my wife and our three children. They are here in the second row. Secondly, I would like to acknowledge my teachers. This is a very special group of people. Let me start by acknowledging the presence of Datin Murugesu up there. Datin Murugesu was my history teacher in LaSalle Secondary School in Sabah at sixth form during our sixth form years. And she certainly was an excellent teacher because for that particular year, the class was able to score 70% A's. So, a teacher extraordinary. Yeah. I also would like to acknowledge the presence of Professor K.S. Nathan, my supervisor for my bachelor degree thesis on China-Malaysia relations, and then subsequently my master's degree thesis on Vietnam-Malaysia relations. And it was him who constantly reminded me that, in academia, it's either publish or perish. Professor Nathan. Next, I would like to acknowledge Professor Lee Kam Heng and also Professor Law. Where is Professor Law? Not here, maybe overseas. Professor Lee and Professor Law were my supervisors at PhD level. And they taught me much more than just academic matters. They also taught me about life. They also have been fantastic counsel throughout my entire career. So Professor Lee and Professor Law. Thank you. By tradition, inaugural lecture is supposed to be a lecture delivered by someone who is recently appointed to the position of professorship. And in my case, it is a bit of embarrassment because this came 8 years later. Like many of our colleagues in we did not pay a lot of attention to this. And therefore, when I put up notices, when friends received invitation to come, many of them were asking me as to whether this is a new appointment or whether this is a new promotion. Well, to my true embarrassment, I have to tell them that, look, this is 8 years late. Perhaps this 8 years is also useful in a way that I may use this as a way of reflecting on the profession that I'm in, the history profession, on the many challenges and also the opportunities that the profession is facing today. And it is not just merely in terms of teaching and research, but also in a way that the subject has impacted or how it should impact the wider society. Many of you, based on the introduction that you got or based on the fact that many of you know me, you remember that I started life being trained for Vietnam. And whenever one visits that country, one is confronted by this very forceful impact on how historical the place is. Everywhere you go, something historical pop up. Either it is a monument to a hero, a shrine to somebody, or maybe it's just purely a former battle site, or every building there seems to be historical. And during my recent visit to Vietnam, one of the things that I was trying to look at was to find traces of discourse on history in the public spheres. This is something that I would like to find out about Vietnam, the country that I've studied in the past. And interestingly, I could find very little, if none. And this caused me to start thinking about what happened. Even before 1975, there were very little, in South Vietnam, there were very little public discourse on history. And under the present regime, public discourse on history simply did not exist, at least formally. For history is a very powerful tool which is controlled by the state, so much so that the state dictates how history should be written. Any discussion in the open would not be tolerated. Now, this, of course, is changing more recently with the sense of greater political openness. People began to start talking about history, about the past, about recognizing enemies, former enemies, and so on, reconciliations. And also, partly due to the technological advancement, especially through the internet. And so one began to find that a lot of discourse began to take place in the public spheres, especially in the cyberspace, where the government control, or it is out of the government control or radar. By contrast, in my home state of Sabah, which I also undertake some work, Sabah is a new modern state that was created as a result of European colonialism. There were very little tangible evidence of a historical past, mainly because during the closing stage of the last war, Second World War, Sabah was bombed up. And Sabah, every building in Sabah seems to be new. Traces of old things seems to have gone. And so was the memory. So does the memory of the past was also missing from the public. And interestingly, discourse on history in the public spheres was very much active in the state. You find that people were interested to find out more about the past, a past that disappeared with the war. People wanted to find out more as to what happened to my ancestors, to my grandfather. What did they do before the war? So these were the things that actually started to get into the public spheres in Sabah. And more recently, in the case of Sabah, Malaysia agreement, people began to talk about Malaysia agreement. People began to talk about the 20 points. Some even talk about whether or not Mat Salleh was a hero or was he a villain. So there is actually a lot of opportunities for people from Sabah, a place with very little history, to talk about history in the public spheres. People actually engage in conversation, not just in the newspapers, but also in the internet. So for me, there is this concern about how much of discourse on history actually taking place in Malaysia. What are the issues involved? Another development which I've been looking at in the past decade is the technological advancement that took place in the internet and social media, and how it may reshape the way we look at the past, and how we treat the past, and how we engage with the past. So this is what the lecture is going to focus on. And so I hope you will bear with me for the next, 50 minutes or so. For many years, discussion on history was the preserve of professional historians, people like us, and teachers of history. Discourse on history was confined to the limited pages of academic journals and books. This was before the time of internet. And for a long time, the focal point has always been on the fundamental issues of historiography. Historiography means the way history is written or being perceived. And public involvement in this era was confined to the limited public spheres, museums, displays in museums, newspaper forums, and perhaps letters to the editors. But this discourse on history in Malaysian public spheres is changing in recent years. It is made possible by the technological advancement in internet and social media. And with this change, discourse on history is no longer the preserve of the historians or teachers of history. The new changes has allowed many, including interested ordinary people people like you who are not historians to carry out research on history, taking on the role of being a netizen historian, because they are publishing, writing, engaging in the cyberspace, becoming a citizen of the net. Therefore, it began to challenge the manner we look at the past and the way we engage in discussing and writing about the past. So the lecture is divided into 4 sections. The first, I'm going to spend a bit of time taking you through the development of history as a subject in Malaysia, and later on to talk about some of the current discourse on history in public spheres. And then I'm going to quickly move on to the rise of internet and the changing patterns of historical research. And finally, to talk a bit about how this group of people, the netizen historians, began to make an impact, influence public discourse on history. So I'm going to just quickly talk about this interesting case about Hang Tuah's origin. Some of you may have started reading things like that on the net, which becomes quite controversial. History. The study of history in Malaysia was initially developed as a subject that was being taught in schools by the British colonial administration. First, it was British history, then it was British and Commonwealth history, and then towards the emergency period, you began to find that textbook began to be more inclusive to talk about history of Malaya in general. And here you are, you have some early textbooks that were being introduced during the Malayan period. And during this time, we find that the focal point is not always Malaya. And the study of history began with this noble aim of instilling sense of patriotism among students and to nurture values and virtues deemed to be crucial in the development of citizenship. Now, these 2 aims were started much earlier at the time when we achieved independence, and today, in the 21st century, we are still holding on to these aims. We have not deviated. Therefore, the idea of patriotism, the idea of citizenship are very crucial in the teaching of history. That's why sometimes people like us, professionals, when we were looking through the textbooks, we thought that, are they teaching history or are they teaching citizenship? So sometimes you have this kind of imbalances and so on. And history as a subject began to take on a different level of understanding and began to focus more on the history of Malaya and Malaysia with the establishment of the history department, first at the University of Malaya in Singapore in 1949, and subsequently in 1959, we have the Department of History, University of Malaya, established in this campus. At that time, we have a group of pioneering historians who began to introduce research on more and more research on the Malay archipelago, on trying to establish some of the fundamental issues pertaining to history in Malaya at that time, and Malaysia, of course. So the department at that time was headed by the first history professor of history, Professor John Bastin. He is still alive today, at the age of 90-something, I was told. And the second professor of history was Professor Wang Gangwu, who is now in Singapore, 85 years old now, but still very sharp, still publishing. Now, what was interesting at that time was that this group of pioneering historians began to do a lot of work that began to try to answer some of the very fundamental questions pertaining to history in Malaysia. Among others, they began to tackle the question about history teaching in Malaya. So this is a cover of the book published in 1964 of a seminar held the year before on teaching history. History teaching is problem in Malaya. It's edited by Professor Zainal Abidin Wahid. And among the contributors from history department at that time would be Professor Wang Gangwu, Dr. David Bassett, Professor Zainal Abidin Wahid, Professor Koo. Professor Koo was not yet a member of the department, but on his way in. Jean Pluvier, famous historian on Dutch Indies. Professor Alistair Lamb, archaeologist who worked on one of the pioneers who actually worked on Lembah Bujang, and Dr. Anthony Short, who was working on the emergency period in Malaya. Together, they established the foundation of the teaching of Malaysian history and also the history of Southeast Asia. And most of these historians were able to explore topics relating to Malaya and then Malaysian history by attempting to resolve some of the fundamental questions pertaining to Malayan history, including the early history and position of the Malaccan Sultanate by Professor Wang, the Kedah and the Penang annexation by the East India Company by R. Boni, the history of Perak prior to the British intervention, Professor Khoo Kay Kim, the communist insurgency in Malaya by Anthony Short, the ancient site of Lembah Bujang by Lamb, the East India Company and its involvement in the Malay archipelago by Professor Bassett, and their findings serve as the basis for further research into the history of the country and the surrounding region. Later, this group of historians were joined by newer members including Leonard and Barbara Andaya, Leong Sao Heng, the archaeologist, Muhammad Yusuf Hashim, who studied the Sultanate of Malacca, Lee Kam Heng, who initially studied Perak and then later on Indonesia, Stephen Leong, who studied the newspaper of the Chinese nationalist movement, and Abdullah Zakaria bin Ghazali, James Onkili, Chabun Keng, and many others. As a result of their work, the knowledge base of Malaysian history was expanded to include state history of Johor, Perak, Terengganu, and even relations between Brunei and the Bornean states. So you have the work of Sabiha Osman, James Onkili, as well as Ranjit Singh. And this period of foundation building was stimulated by the existence of several influential journals dedicated to the study of history. One of them, on your right-hand side, is the Journal of the Historical Society of the University of Malaya. Now, this is a journal that was actually run by final year students. But because of the contributions of the staff member of the department as well as other renowned historians, this journal seems to be a very influential journal in the 60s and early 70s. And later on, in 1998, the Department of History published Sejarah. It means history. And this journal is still in circulation, and now it is being published twice a year. Apart from the journals published by the department, you also have the Journal of Southeast Asian History. Now it's known as Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, published now by Cambridge University Press. Now this was originally edited by K.G. Tregoning, and it developed into the premier, most important journals in Southeast Asia, on Southeast Asia. And many of our colleagues, many of our the departmental staff actually published their articles in this journal. Then you have the long-standing Journal of the Malaysian branch of the Royal Aesthetic Society. The covers have changed many times now, and this is the most influential journal on the history of Malaysia and also the local history. However, even with this kind of publication, it must be emphasized that even then, discourse on history in Malaysia was still very much confined to the learned universities community. The preserve of the professional historians. Public discourse on history was confined to sporadic letters to the editors of these journals by some concerned readers. There were also some letters to newspapers, again, sporadic and few in between. The issue that actually dominated the early part of the development of history in Malaysia will be these two major issues. First, the question of perspectives or approaches, which basically focuses on Eurocentric versus Asian and Malaysian-centric. The issue was how should history be written and whose history was it? Thus emerged ideas of Western-centric versus Asian or Malaysian-centric. The issue almost became a debate between the locals and the expats, each accusing each other of being biased in the employment of sources and their putting forward their viewpoints. A pen war was waged in the journals, and the debate, though no longer relevant or major concern today, nevertheless has some residual effect which lasted until much later, when some historians began to look at anything foreign as Western-centric, to the point of discounting the use of Western or other foreign sources when researching Malaysian history. The second issue at that time was whether or not we should recognize Malay texts, traditional Malay texts such as Sejarah Melayu, Tufat Al-Nafis, Hikayat Hang Tuah, and others, as historical sources or historical texts. There were different types of arguments. Some said that, look, this kind of materials are purely literature. They are full of myths and legends, no dates at all. How can we call them historical sources? But others were saying that, look, there are information in it that will help us to bridge gaps. There are information that will help us to move forward in our research, because without these sources, we can't move. We can't actually answer a lot of questions pertaining to the period of Malacca onwards in the Malay archipelago. And therefore, some kind of understanding came into being, and some say that, look, as long as you could discount those myths and legends and find your facts, then we should accept them as historical sources. That seems to be the solution, because subsequently we have people who build their career based on this kind of sources. The development of history in Malaysia, actually received a lot of support from non-professional historians. We have associations such as the Malaysian Historical Society, Persatuan Sejarah Malaysia, and its many local chapters that actually promote the study of history, research on local histories. And they published a very influential journal. At one point, it was very influential. It's called Malaysia dari Segi Sejarah, Malaysia in History. Now, this is still in circulation, and at one point, it has an English version as well. Now, the Persatuan Sejarah Malaysia actually have many local chapters, and through them, a lot of school teachers, in particular, were actively involved and started to engage in research on local history. And these actually are very crucial in helping us to uncover a lot of information about the past, especially from different locations in the country. The other institution that has played very important role in the development of history would be your museums and would be your museums. Every state seems to have a museum, and they too began to devote resources on research. And as a result of that, many of their research are being published in different journals that were started. The Sarawak Museum Journal, for instance, started in 1911, is probably the most influential. And Sabah Museum Journal started as well during the 60s. And you also have the Selangor. In Selangor, you also have the Selangor Museum Journal. And other journals, such as the Sabah Society Journal, which was started or published by the Sabah Society, are also making very important contributions to the local history. During the 90s, we began to see a lot of history-based columns appearing in newspapers. Now, these history columns are very, very important in stimulating public discourse on history. And among them was Khoo Kay Kim, Professor Khoo's History Alive. This was, I think, probably one of the earliest that emerged at that time, published in the Star. He kept it going for several years before moving on to start another column in the New Straits Times. It's called Its History. And then later on, we have Professor Loh Wai Ling, who coordinated this series called Window to the Past, also published by the Star. Myself, I've done some, I kept a column alive for 7 years in the Daily Express Sabah, and we call it Historical Sabah. And later on, Dr. Joseph Fernando, my colleague in the history department as well, also organized a column called The Founding Fathers, also published in the Star. In the Chinese newspaper, we also have Dr. An Huan Rang, this one, who actually maintained a weekly column called 边缘评论. This is dedicated to the study of the Chinese community in Malaysia. Now, these columns actually help to stimulate a lot of public discourse, a lot of letters to the editors, a lot of letters to people like us who were maintaining these columns, and started to have some discussion. And sometimes, interestingly, they also stimulated others to begin to work on their own history. I used to get letters who came and people wrote to me because of the column, asking me, how did you find out about my grandfather? You know, how do you know that he was actually producing noodle? You know, things like that. And of course, I would tell them, you know, we got this information from the archives, we got it from here and there, and I can send you some of these things. And a few months later, you find that these people began to send back things. They began to do their research and came back with some kind of a mini thesis or a little booklet and things like that. Of course, many of them were not published, but then at least that will help the family to have a sense of the past. And this is the kind of contribution that we really appreciate. And this kind of newspaper column began as a way to stimulate debate, and today we still find them very important. But lately we don't find too many of these columns in the English newspapers now. In 2002 between 2002 to 2008, there was this magazine. I don't know if you have seen it before. It's called Heritage Asia. It's actually produced by Professor Lee Gam Heng and also one of our graduates, Dr. Neil Kaur, English department graduate, who worked together to produce this very interesting history magazine. Now, at its height, I was told it has 10,000 in circulation and has a subscription base of 5,000. Now, I wish our journal can have this kind of subscription and this kind of circulation. But it was a commercial, in a way, it was a commercial effort, and it actually helped to actually promote a lot of understanding of the past as well as heritage in Southeast Asia, not just in Malaysia. Now, what is going to follow later on is I'm going to touch on some discourse on history that are currently taking place in the Malaysian public spheres. And for this, I may need to read a bit. I hope you will bear with me. I don't want to get it wrong in the way of some of these facts. The first thing that I think for many years now, the public has been voicing their concerns about the many shortcomings in the school history textbook, including inaccuracies, and the more exclusive manner in which they are written. So it is a very sensitive issue in a multi-racial nation like ours. In fact, this issue is among the most discussed history topics in Malaysian public spheres. This is not just an indication of the importance of the issue to Malaysians who are concerned that unless properly addressed, the issue would impede efforts for nation building. Now, we find that if you look through the results of SPM, which is the school certificate examination, you find that until recently, the passing rate has not been very high. It's always hovering around 70%, which is actually very sad, which shows that history is not really a very popular subject in school. Something must have happened. Now, this, for me, this actually has in many ways threatened the attainment of the noble goal of achieving national unity, having a sense of patriotism, and having all those virtues that were the noble aim of the syllabus. There is a general perception, now this is the general perception, what the public perceive, that the Education Ministry and those who were involved in the production of history textbook were inclined towards an Islamic and Malay-centric perspective. Central to this are the controversial Form 4 and Form 5 textbooks. Based on the syllabus, Form 4 textbook aims at providing students with a broad understanding of the world's many civilizations. And the Form 5 textbooks focuses on Malaysia's emergence as a modern nation state. The problem with the Form 4 text is that instead of introducing students to the many civilizations, including the Chinese civilization, the Indian civilization, Mesopotamia, Egyptian, and so on, 5 out of the 10 chapters of the text are devoted to Islamic civilization, culture, and society. Now, this is very much contrary to the syllabus, because the syllabus demands each civilization given a fair treatment. But instead, we get 5 chapters. Now, this actually reinforces the public perception that there is an inclination towards an Islamic perspective. As for the Form 5 text, the lack of acknowledgement of the historical presence and contribution of non-Malays in the country is most glaring. The role of non-Malays, including Bumiputra of Sabah and Sarawak, deemed to be marginalized, and their role in the independence movement and nation building were largely reduced to a minimum. Now, such treatment of Malaysian history has met with strong objections from segments of the community. This was where discourse on history in the Malaysian public sphere was at its height, was at its best. Numerous opinions were expressed, including the very strong statement from the new Chief Minister of Sarawak, Tan Sri Adnan Satem, who has also expressed concern that the textbooks have not discussed adequately the role of non-Malays, as well as the historical development in East Malaysia. Another history-related topics that is attracted some attention in the public sphere is this particular case where some people in 2006 began to champion for the erection or the construction of a monument in Nilai for the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, MPAJA. MPAJA, as you know, was the military arm of the Communist Party of Malaya. And they wanted to commemorate this group of people as the heroes of Malaya, of Malaysia. And of course, immediately, this started a whole range of discussion in the public spheres. People began to say that you can't be doing that. Are you serious about this? And of course, those who fought against the communists during the emergency were also angry about this. So you had this very long debate that was going on. And somehow this kind of debate began to have a division between those who were for the ideas, usually would be associated with the opposition party, political parties. And then those who were against would be from the establishment or from the Barisan Nasional and so on. This is a very sad way of division in a way, but somehow it happened. Next would be whether Force 136, Malay or Chinese. Again, you had this race thing came into play. Again, you also have this issue about whether or not you are supposed to be pro-government, then you say it's only Malay, and then if you are pro, you are anti-government, or if you are the opposition, you are supposed to say that they are also Chinese and so on. So this debate actually went on, and this divide was actually very, very sad. And these are all historical topics. Next, Chin Peng to come back. Should he come back or not? Again, there was a campaign that started. Again, you have this huge public discourse. Some will say that, look, we are dead against him for coming back. We fought in the jungle. I lost my leg. And how can you allow people like this? You know? Some say, look, he was a hero after all. MPAJA, he fought against the Japanese. He was even awarded the Order of the British Empire. Of course, he was taken back later on by the British government when the emergency started. And they said, look, you have to honor him. But of course, many people, including Tun Hanif Omar, said, look, you can't be serious. You know, we lost lives. These people turned their guns against fellow Malaysians. So we can't be honoring them. We can't be having them back. So this thing actually went on. The debate went on until Chin Peng finally passed away in Bangkok. So he didn't make it back. But there were still attempts to try to bring him back. Again, the debate trickled on, but no longer a major issue. Next, more recently, history came out in the public sphere in a rather big way, because when someone by the name of Mat Indra became the focal point. Now, Mat Indra was an alleged freedom fighter who was the leader of the Malayan Communist Party forces that attacked Bukit Kepong police station in February 1950. And during that attack, which is now made famous by these movies by Jin Samsudin that were being shown every year during Merdeka month, I think we have some notion about how it took place and so on. But the idea here was that the opposition party leader, Mat Sabu, actually made a statement. When he made a statement saying that in 2001, he said that Mat Indra and his followers who attacked the police station were the true heroes of Malaysia because they fought against the British. Now, this statement elicited a barrage of responses. People began to come and say, how can you say that? Again, there is this communist versus non-communist kind of argument. Again, establishment versus, the opposition kind of argument. And politicians from the ruling party accused the opposition leader of deliberately bringing up an issue in discrediting the founding fathers of the nation and glorifying the communists. The accusation infuriated many from the ruling party, and police reports were made, and Mat Sabu was dragged to the court of law. And so began, because he was accused of dishonoring the memory of the people who fought, who died in Bukit Kepong, and also for making false accusation against them and those who survived the attack. So many experts were invited, among them Dr. Carl Heck of Open University of UK, a famous specialist on communism in Chin Peng. And later on, they also invited Professor Koo to make a statement of being witness in the court case. And both actually came up with the statement that Mat Indra was not a nationalist, but a communist. Now, for a while, this case captured the attention of many because people began to debate, began to talk about it. And today, if you want to look into some of these debates, you can still see them, watch them on YouTube, and also other websites. But even as the court case dragged on, the event took on a different twist when Professor Koo, while giving evidence in Mat Sabu and Mat Indra case, declared that the policemen at Bukit Kepong were effectively serving the sultans and not the British. And therefore, Mat Indra actually attacked the sultan rather than the British. He argues that Mat Indra and his men were attacking the policemen that were under the sovereignty of the sultan and not Britain. Prof. Koo was reported to have declared that Malaya and its 9 sovereign monarchies had never been colonized. This was based on the nature of the treaty between Britain and the 9 sultans and rulers, was that they were protectorates, not colonies. Therefore, Malaya was never colonized. By implication, the 9 rulers continued to exercise power, and that Malaya was the Naungi, that's been protectorate, and not the Jajah, not colonized. So Professor Koo's statement, sparked off another round of debate among Malaysians over a historical issue. Some of you may recall that a lot of our professors appeared on TV, started to debate on whether or not Malaysia was ever colonized and so on. Now this went on for a long time. But just as we thought that the issue would abate with the passing of time, Dr. Rachel Liao, the beautiful lady there, Malaysian, trained in Cambridge and now teaching in the history faculty at Cambridge University, she sustained this debate by writing an open letter to Professor Koo, and it was published online, published in the major newspapers. Rachel Liao pointed out that Professor Koo was relying on semantic, not historical sources, and that the use of this claim that, I quote, Malaya stands entirely outside the set of objects of historical study called colonial empire is not only wrong, it is positively perverse, unquote. So this was what was written by Rachel Liao in her letter. Rachel drew upon Professor Koo's own study to argue how the British undermined the position of the Orang Besar, that there was a policy of ruling the Malays through their sultans, and that a more elaborate and highly centralized administrative machineries replaced the indigenous system. So the question of continuity and change in Malaysian history and the question of reinterpreting Malaysia's history is captured in Rachel Liao's letter. Today, that's the last major topic of historical discourse in Malaysian public sphere. It demonstrates the discourse on history in the Malaysian public spheres that has definitely increased and spread wider over the years. With a better educated population who genuinely concerned about the nation's history and the country's future as well, many views were expressed through the press as well as through other avenues. Now, this has definitely kept the spirit of discourse going strong. While some of the issues were no longer relevant, others, like the issue of teaching of history and the textbooks, persisted and remained a topic of contention. Now, I was made recently by a friend from Kementerian that a new syllabus and a new textbook is going to be introduced soon. And I hope this problem will be resolved by then, hopefully. Now, it was in the next phase of development, especially through the advancement made in the internet and social media, which takes us to another level of discourse, which saw significant shift in the manner historians operate in the future. We all are, in some way, are citizens of the net. So therefore, we probably can call ourselves netizens in some ways. When internet was introduced, historians, just like anyone else, also began to adapt very fast to these technological changes. We began to see that we, too, began to serve the net initially, end user. We know how to Skype, talk to each other, talk to our colleagues across the seas. we began to have develop websites. Some of us who are dedicated to some kind of historical studies began to champion our cause by having websites, and also some kept blogs, and some people like me just barely able to do Facebook, and so on. Now, everyone seems to be on this net. If you're not on the net, you probably will be 20 years behind. New mode of publications also emerge. We don't find people carrying books. We see them carrying a pad or a phone, begin to read from them. And we find these things, online publication, reading from online sources, e-books. People can publish their own books now. You don't have to go through a publisher. You don't have to go through stringent refereeing process, which costs you headache, because you can publish on your own. E-journals, historians began to publish in e-journals. All our journals, including Sejarah, are now e-journals. We have the print. We also have the e-journals. E-magazines, such as History Today, very influential. BBC History, these are all very famous history journal magazines that are now online. You can find them online. So we are all very much into this. And for historians, many of us have been spending months away from home, sitting quietly, in the heart of the archives, flipping through old documents and so on, dusty with all these terrible things to do, And today, with the new databases, a lot of first-hand information, a lot of sources are now online. In the Diet Archives of Japan, they put out a lot of information about Japanese activities in Southeast Asia before the war. Australian National Archives, you can get a lot of documents pertaining to the formation of Malaysia, free, FOC. Some you have to pay. Even then, all it takes is the swipe of your card, and you get your sources in 3 weeks' time. And the National Archives of UK, they don't put up a lot of documents for you, but you can purchase them. You can buy tons of documents as long as you can pay them, or you can get someone to pay for you. The National Library of Singapore also offered some online information. A lot of the old newspapers of Malaya and Singapore are now available on this website. So you literally can sit at home to do your work. You don't have to travel. You don't have to, actually get a grant or something like that in order to find sources. You can actually do it at home. So with this kind of facilities, this kind of databases, it is now possible for academics and non-academics, professional historians, amateurs, lay people to carry out research and engage in discourse and publish them, get them published. You don't even have to go to a proper publisher. You can publish it under your own brand name, right? So this has changed the way we operate. This has changed the way we do history. And therefore, it will have some influence on how we look into history. And because of this, we began to find that a lot of people began to engage in some kind of historical research. History began to become very popular. Everyone can do history. Everyone can publish. And you find that never before, people can actually publish so much and get their voices heard. You also don't, no longer constrained by the limited space of print media. You don't have to go through, you can even escape the control of the state so long as you don't say something sensitive and so on. Well, in this way, many actually done very good work. We have seen some very outstanding work coming from netizen historians. And they should be, we should call them truly netizen historians. But we also have on the internet, just as in other spheres of activities, you also have some very questionable remarks, people putting up blogs, putting up comments, posted comments that are very negative, that very much reflective of racial chauvinism, mischievous, bigotry, some even spreading lies, and so on. If I may quote the work of Professor Muhammad Haji Saleh, he said that lately, the blogs and websites on the internet that are quite wanting in proof, evidence proof. Many are drenched with emotion, racial, tribal, and also personal sentiments. In this free-floating work of emotions and passions, these advocates veer quite far from their sources and often do not stand on the firm ground of evidence and common sense. Now, hundreds of blogs, often from oral sources or reasoning, present to us episodes and spontaneous perspectives that have already drowned the scarce historical facts which were not given much chance of rearing its head. This was from Professor Muhammad Haji Saleh, who is a very famous scholar, and he began to notice this kind of activities, this kind of unhealthy activities that's going on. But nonetheless, the netizens were still very, very influential. And next, I'm going to demonstrate to you how influential they could be. This is a brass wrapping that you can on Hang Tuah that you can find in the National Museum. So this is the classic one, always appear on textbook cover. And here you have Tam Layu Hilang di Dunia. And Hang Tuah has always been the national hero to all of us. Although he was the Malay warrior from the Malaccan period, but the way he was portrayed in our national ethos is that that's the true Malaysian hero. For many years, I don't know if you remember this, there is a Pingat Hang Tuah, instituted in 1960, sustained, given up until 1978. This was a medal given for gallantry, for bravery, for children under the age of 12 who probably saved someone from drowning or for fire and so on. So every year during the Children's Day, National Children's Day, the Agong will actually pin this medal on the winner. And sometimes it's a girl. So you have the Sri Kandi instead of, the Vira and the hero. And we don't know why it was discontinued after 1978, but lately we noticed that some states also started to reintroduce this Pingat Hang Tuah concept, trying to revive this idea about Hang Tuah and the values that actually he embodied: unselfishness, loyal, and being brave, and so on. And we also have 2 movies being made for Hang Tuah. You have the first one, Piramli, the famous one, where in this one he was fighting against Hang Jebat, and also M. Nasir quoting Putri Gunung Ledang. This is a more recent edition. We also have our KD Hang Tuah, one of our Royal Malaysian Navy ship was named after Hang Tuah, and that is one of our frigates. And then you have Kopi Hang Tuah, that saying you should be brave afterwards. And in Indonesia, you also have Universitas Hang Tuah in Surabaya. You also have a Sekolah Tinggi Ilmu Kesihatan in Hang Tuah Pekanbaru. So Hang Tuah was basically a very important institution, not just any name, but an institution to all of us. But here you are. One day, this guy by the name of John Chow, or he called himself John Chow, began to put out a blog, in his blog, this posting. He began to challenge the origins of Hang Tuah. He said, if I may, quote, this is what I heard, findings of the team of scientists, archaeologists, historians, and other technical staff from the United States. The S, without S, this was from him, not from me. United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, Yemen, and Russia. The graves of Hang Tuah, Hang Jebat, Hang Lekyu, and their close friends have been found, and their skeletons have been analyzed. Their DNA had been analyzed, and it is found that Hang Tuah, Hang Jebat, Hang Lekyu, etc., are not Malay, but Chinese. Islamic Chinese, just like the famous Admiral Cheng Ho, Zheng He. Now, Malacca, he went on and said, Malacca was a protectorate of China at the time, and the Emperor of China sent the Sultan of Malacca, yellow gifts, all these yellow color umbrellas and so on, as a token of his sovereignty. The 5 warrior brothers were believed to be sent to help protect Malacca and its Sultan from Siam. So this was by John Chow. It looks very authentic. It looks as though some research had gone into it. He went on and talked about the term Hang. Hang should be like Hang Li Po. If Hang Li Po is Hang, was a Chinese, therefore Hang Tua would be a Chinese as well. But he went on and talked about semantic. He went on and talked about other evidence. Very convincing. He even furnished you with a website. And you can actually go and take a look. Now, because of that, it started off a debate online. This kind of debate was very fierce. Some of them said, look, I can say that there is no real evidence due to distortion in historical facts, and that because the Hittite Hang Tuah was altered by the influence of the British. All right? This is the first time I'm hearing this, but someone actually put it out. And someone said, the Sultan was visited by the famous Chinese Admiral Zheng He, and there were dealings between him and the Emperor of China and the Sultan of Malacca. Another question of allegiance is that Hang Li Po was, and there were a lot of debate, but this is the top one. My ancestor came with Hang Li Po, Hang Tuah Jebat. When was yours? This was asked by this guy. Now, again, this is reflective of what Professor Muhammad Haji Saleh was trying to, imply in his statement, saying that, look, things can go haywire on the internet. Someone came out and defended Hang Tuah not being a Chinese. He said, whenever we speak about Hang Tuah, many history blind fools will claim that this famous Malay warrior is Chinese. In fact, they brought up points and information to further prove that Hang Tuah is Chinese. Thus, we write this article to rebut these ridiculous points and give you real facts about Hang Tuah. Now, this thing went on and on. You just go and Google information about Hang Tuah controversies, you get plenty of them. But interestingly, it all started off with this guy, John Chow. And John Chow, we don't know who he was. He could be among us here. I don't know. But what happened was that it also got the authority worries, because what he did was to challenge the very essence of Malay identity, Malay ethos of warriors, of loyalty, and so on. And then suddenly, that hero was no longer a Malay, but could be a Chinese. So this was it. And it started a frantic kind of responses. And then they said, let us go and ask historians. They asked Khoo Kay Kim, Hang Tuah a Chinese? He said, actually, Hang Tuah was never existed. And of course, this became a very big issue. They said, oh, Khoo Kay Kim, Khoo Kay Kim, we better move on and ask other people. They went and asked Muhammad Haji Saleh. Muhammad Haji Saleh said, Prof. Muhammad Haji Saleh said, look, all my life in my research, I always pointed out that Hang Tuah has been a myth. Again, there's no answer to what they wanted. And they went on to ask Farish Noor. Now, Farish Noor was once my classmate, Form 2 and Form 3 in LaSalle, Sabah. And Farish Noor, being the gentleman and very, diplomatic, he said, actually, he never existed. But we should emulate the values, the kind of bravery, the kind of loyalty that he embodied. Smart man, being a scholar. And finally, they came to Professor Ahmad Adam. Prof. Ahmad Adam said, no. He never existed. Let me show you. I got a book to show you, that he never existed. And you had frantic official response. Because of this, you get a response that was out of proportion. People began to organize forums, seminars, conferences, trying to make sense whether or not Hang Tuah existed. And then there was some people who who went on and claimed that, look, I am the descendant of Hang Tuah, this group. And others said, okay, let us find some empirical data. So the UPM, two scholars from UPM actually did some studies, and finally they traced the Pebble Trail to Okinawa, the islands of Okinawa in Japan. Now, Okinawa formerly was called Ryukyu, the kingdom of Ryukyu, before it was annexed by the Japanese during the closing stages of 19th century. Now, Ryukyu maintained a cordial relationship with Malacca. So these people went over to Ryukyu or to Okinawa. They found in the temples or in some of the texts, they said, look, we found evidence of 3 letters written by a certain Laksamana in 1485 to the king of Ryukyu. 3 letters. There you are, evidence of the existence of Hang Tuah. Hang Tuah actually existed. But of course, we all know that Laksamana is a very generic term, admiral, leader of a military force. In fact, if you go to a place like Sabah or Sarawak, deep in the heartland of Sabah and Sarawak, where you can't find sea, you also have Datu Laksamana, the title for a native chief. Or you have a Raja Laksamana, another title for a native chief who have never seen a drop of sea water in his life, but he had that title. But nonetheless, the team came back, they published a book and launched by no less than the Deputy Prime Minister. And you can get that book in the bookstores. Now, the debate went on. Tun Ahmad Saji, the 2 chief ministers of Malacca, Prof. Nick, Sohaimi, all came out and say, yes, Hang Tuah actually existed. But you also have a big book there by Professor Ahmad Adam, who says that, look, it is antara sejarah dan mitos. Between history and myth, you have to make a distinction. So that's his argument. Now, if you look at this episode in our public discourse, you realize that this is something that's gone out of proportion. But started with one John Chow, right? We don't even know who he was or who he is. And somewhat the thing that he posted made such an impact. People began to spin. And this is the power of the internet. This is the power of the netizens. And historians got to do something about it. Or at least we must know how to respond. So in conclusion, I'm sorry that I've kept you on for such a long time, but let me conclude by saying that discourse on history in the public spheres in Malaysia is definitely gaining ground. And unless satisfactorily resolved, the issue on the teaching of history in school and the problematic textbooks will remain a leading topic in the public discourse on history. Less so the question about Hang Tuah. However, for many years, this discourse were limited by the space available, especially in the print media. But the proliferation of the internet and social media has provided a larger platform and space for the Malaysian public to engage in discourse on history. Yet, despite of this newfound space and the many discussion on historical issues, there is a need to pose and ask how historians should respond to this major shift. How do we deal with this change, the rise of netizen historians? To engage, or should we ignore them? Well, my suggestion is that historians need to be sensitive to changes and discourse, and perhaps we should also engage. Historians should also continue to make history alive and relevant. We should actually make it alive, not just at this level, but to the public and also in schools. To engage by adapting to changes, including technological changes. Now, historians are pretty fast in adapting changes. I noticed that most of our historian friends are very fast in adapting to internet and all these online things. But we have to keep at it. We cannot be left behind. And most important of all, we should continue to safeguard the integrity of history profession. We should improve the quality of research and teaching and we should be sensitive to the concern of the society and nation. I would like to quote in my closing from Marc Bloch. Now, Marc Bloch belongs to the School of Annals, in the History School of Annals, French historian. He wrote this in 1940 in this book called The Strange Defeat, when he was trying to find an answer to the question as to why France lost the war during the summer of 1940. And he said, I quote, "For a man to form a clear idea of the needs of society and to make an effort to spread his views widely is to introduce a grain of heaven into the general mentality. By so doing, he gives himself a chance to modify it to some extent, and consequently to bring some influence to bear upon the course of events that, in the last analysis, are dictated by human psychology. The real trouble with us, his professors, was that we were absorbed in our day-to-day talks. Most of us can say with some justice that we were good workmen. Is it equally true to say that we were good citizens?" So that's from Marc Bloch. Before I close, I would like to take this opportunity to thank a lot of people. Professor Awang for chairing the session. I know he's a very busy man, but we are happy that he could come and chair the session, and it is an honor. The Dean of our faculty, Associate Professor Dr. Hanafi Hussain, who is actually officially the host of our talk today. Encik Muhammad Khair Yunus, the Principal Assistant Registrar, and his team for making this possible. They did all the arrangements and so on. Dr. Evelyn Koh, the Director of International and Corporate Relations, and a team that helped to take the pictures, that helped to give a lot of the publicities and so on. Mr. Adam Wong of the Penerbit and team, and my team from the History Department, the Institute of China Studies, and the Global Planning and Strategy Center for helping me to make this possible. Now, just last bit, by customary, we should publish a book that you should bring back. But somewhat, we would send it to you. So I would appreciate that if you could actually, on your way out, drop a card, a name card. We know we have your email address. That's how we reach most of you, actually. But we would appreciate if you could actually drop your name cards or write your name on the attendance list with your address, postal address, so that we can actually send the booklet to you. That will be the text for today's lecture. So with that, I would like to once again thank all of you for taking time off to come and listen to this lecture, and I wish all of you well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Danny Wong. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to call upon Professor Dr. Awang Bulkiba Awang Mahmud to conclude the lecture, which was delivered by Professor Dr. Danny Wong.
Thank you very much, Prof. Danny Wong. Now, I came from the science stream. Some of you may know that I eventually became a medical doctor. But before you say anything, one of my favorite subjects in school was actually history. And my least favorite subject, incidentally, was biology. Yeah, it's funny how things turn out. The thing about history is that what fascinates me about history is that there are many lessons that we learn from history. Unfortunately, individuals and even entire nations tend to underestimate the value of the lessons from history. Hence, we see misadventures, for example, by countries in invading other countries, like, for example, Afghanistan, just to give an example. Afghanistan is a country which has never been which no country has ever been able to rule, invade successfully. The British tried it, and others tried it, the Russians tried it, and the Americans tried it, and everybody has left. So there are lessons in that kind of history, and yet people still fail to heed these lessons in history. Now, it's very interesting when you talk about Hikayat Hang Tuah. I was a very avid reader when I was a child, and I used to go to the library just about every other day during the school holidays. So I used to finish one book a day and go back to the library after 2 days, return the book, borrow another 2 books. And I read a lot of books about history, especially about the state of Sarawak, because that's where I come from. What I realized was when reading about the history, the historical perspective, it was told very much from the British point of view. I'm not saying that the facts are wrong, but of course the perspective, and I realized that it tended to contradict with what history that I was taught in school. I also, incidentally, when I was about 9 years old, read the entire volume of Hikayat Hang Tuah. And that's about, 500 pages, I think. I read it. And I came to the conclusion after reading the entire Hikayat Hang Tuah, this cannot be real. Because there was a lot of mythology in the very beginning. I was wondering, I mean, you can't be serious. You are talking about, in the way that they talk about the Majapahit Empire, the states, the kingdoms came about. And it sounded very unreal to me. But anyway, so I came to the conclusion that it's either something wrong with the Hikayat Hang Tuah, or I should read it purely for literature and not for history, or as a historical fact. Now, interestingly, I would classify us, those of us who are about 50 or 50 plus now, as having had 2 phases in our life, BI and AI. What's BI and what's AI? BI is before internet. So AI is after internet. When did this internet thing start in Malaysia? I think Jaring was introduced in 92, perhaps in early 90s. I registered my first email address in 96. There was a Hotmail address, which I still maintain to this very day. My Jaring email address has died now with Jaring. Jaring is already gone out of business. Now, before internet, public discourse was very limited for us. Public discourse meant that you had to sit in a room like this and then put up your points and so on and so on. And there were a lot of, some would call it establishment censorship. Some would call it self-censorship, because a lot of us don't want to upset other people, so we censor ourselves and we don't say what we should be saying. But after the internet came to view, now people started setting up websites, personal websites. I didn't want to set up a personal website. I thought it was quite crazy to set up a personal website. And then when blogs became the fashion, people put in blogs. But of course, blogs, although there's feedback that you can give, but you can always delete the comments which people give, and you can moderate the comments. It was a selective kind of dialogue, whereas personal websites tend to be a monologue. Nobody could respond. But social media changed all that. And with social media and with the availability of apps and the mobile internet that we know nowadays, the volume of public discourse has increased exponentially. With it, of course, things happen, like Prof. Danny Wong has said. Sometimes things tend to be emotional, they can be inflammatory, and could be attributed to bigotry even. Is this good or is this bad? We are at a stage of development in Malaysia where I would say we are somewhere in the teenage years. Yes, suddenly we realize that we are growing up very quickly. We have certain freedoms which are allowed of us, and sometimes we do not really know how to put this or do this in a more mature manner. For those of us who are in the 5th decade of life, or the 6th decade of life rather, then we realize that, yes, with freedom comes responsibility too. And inflaming others perhaps may not be the wisest thing to do. It sounds very much like a teenager ranting at not being recognized or not being allowed to speak their mind, or people not understanding you. Yet, this is a stage that I believe that we must pass through, because in a nation's development, the ability to discuss in a coherent manner, in a calm manner, it's very important. We do not want to go and experience what certain states have experienced, which suddenly found great freedom very suddenly, and an inability to handle that freedom. And we have seen states fracture as a result of that. So where are we in the public discourse? Public discourse, I believe, should be encouraged. Public discourse will go through a stage where we will become more rational. We will become, hopefully, more accepting, not tolerant, but accepting of others' views, and be able to work out what is reasonable and what is not reasonable. So I think, in my mind, this has been a very interesting inaugural lecture. And incidentally, I was quite intrigued that there is a Universitas Hang Tuah, so I learned something very new today. There's a Sekolah Tinggi Kesihatan, Hang Tuah, and that's related to my own field. So I was thinking, my God, is that a medical school or a public health school called Hang Tuah, which I know absolutely nothing about. It appears to be in Indonesia of all countries. It's not even in Malaysia. It's been a very interesting inaugural lecture. And I believe this might provoke, again, discussions about public discourse. And I think this is a healthy thing to have. So with this, I'm sure you will agree with me that we had a most interesting and illuminating inaugural lecture today. And so please join me in thanking Prof. Danny Wong for this inaugural lecture.
Thank you, Professor Awang Bulgiba Awang Mahmud, for sharing this lecture. Indeed, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the management of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, International Corporate Relations Office ICR, all members of the University Malaya, and our guests for your time and continuous commitment. With this, we have reached to the end of the lecture. Everyone is invited for refreshments served at the Dataran Sastera. Once again, thank you for making this morning a successful and memorable one. Have a pleasant day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you take care of me, please?